Welcome to the finale episode of After the Deluge, a Jackson Browne podcast. I had the idea for this show last fall, and I did a few interviews and really enjoyed them, but shelved it almost immediately because I just struggled to find the time to make it happen. When the quarantine started, I just sort of picked it up and ran without thinking too much about it. And basically, this entire weird period in our world, which is characterized by a pandemic and civil unrest around racial injustice, has run parallel to this podcast. And it's even found its way into some of the conversations. I basically only know this period in history as something that overlaps entirely with this podcast, which in its own unique way might also be true for you as a listener. So it's a little bit sad to watch it come to its end, but it's also really satisfying and exciting. One quick note before I get into this actual episode: don't unsubscribe after this one. I'm calling it a finale because it's the last one in the weekly series, but Jackson Browne is at work on a new album, and that's going to come out sometime in the semi-near future, and I'm going to pop up with a really special episode for that one. So stay subscribed, and then you'll find it in your feed when it arrives. And now we're going to take a quick sentimental trip down memory lane. We covered 4 decades of music in 3 months on this series, and I cannot thank the guests enough.
I love the 70s California record making. It's there's just something pretty great about everything kind of made during that era.
Jamaica was the lovely one, I played her well.
Some people just fucking have it. Not that Jackson Browne didn't work really hard to be a successful musician and a successful songwriter. It takes a lot of effort, but it doesn't matter how hard you work. You're not writing these days when you're 16.
Well, I've been out walking.
Really, it's about Jackson Browne's vocals playing off David Lindley's guitar. David Lindley's guitar is very prominent, especially on Late for the Sky. His guitar is just sort of shadowing the vocal.
When it gets to that heavier point in the song, and then it kind of lets you down again just to end it, it's like I just experienced a whole movie in 2 minutes.
They have all passed under sleep's dark and silent.
I was on my couch just kicking back, and he said, "We're going to play Jackson Browne's new album, start to finish, no commercials, no interruptions." It changed my life. I'm not kidding.
It's more than getting high in a hotel room hiding from Greg Londoni. It's more than, man, David Lindley, does he haul ass on that pedal steel or what, right? Those things are all incidental, very powerful, but the truth comes down to a man and a piano, and it's time to leave. It's all over. There is no more music to be had here.
Now the seats are all empty. Let the roadies take the stage, pack it up and tear it down.
He had made 5 really good, and at least in 1 or 2 cases, I think, truly superb records in a row. And that's, a pretty extraordinary run.
It went from MTV taking their cues from radio to the other way around. Radio started to take their cues from MTV. People were really trying to figure it out as they went.
I can't keep up with what's been going down.
It opens up with da 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 da. So there's a hook, and then there's another guitar hook that comes in after that. Da 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 da. There's just hook after hook after hook.
I like the tension, the way he sort of challenges you, that whether you're doing something or not, it's all happening, and you probably ought to get in the game, because if you don't, probably the people you don't want to win, they're in the game and they're making things go down.
And they're calling out to one another, and the lovers up and down the strand. In the sound of the waves and the cries of the seagulls circling the sand.
There's a moment to where both the times are right and the artist is in the right moment to restate their purpose or reassess why they're here. My deepest understanding of his youth is in that song. You literally think of this kid, I always do, like this weird, beautiful poet child coming up in some sort of like church in the middle, like off of Sunset.
What with all my expectations long abandoned.
For any weirdo young music fan who's in high school or college or the 20s, who is like, for whatever reason, attracted to music by artists who are much older than them and like discovering their legendary albums, there's always this really exciting moment when that artist puts out their first album of new material, and it's like since you've become a fan, it's such an exciting moment.
Standing in the Breach is Jackson Browne's 14th studio album and was released in October of 2014. My first guest today is Anthony DeCurtis, who wrote the Rolling Stone review for Standing in the Breach. Our conversation starts with that, but we sort of spin that conversation into his whole career as we go. Anthony has covered Jackson Browne extensively during his time at Rolling Stone, and it really shows. He's written several books, including In Other Words, Artists Talk About Their Life and Work, and Lou Reed, A Life. He's a professor in the English department at the University of Pennsylvania, where he teaches a few of the coolest sounding classes I could possibly describe. You'll hear a little bit about those in our conversation. You can find Anthony on Twitter at @DeCurtis, ADECURTIS. After Anthony, I'm joined by Angie Martoccio. Angie writes for Rolling Stone as well and largely covers the singer-songwriter beat. Angie and I talk not only about Jackson Browne, but also about some younger artists who have been inspired by him or in some cases actively championed by him. I'll introduce Angie in more detail in just a little bit. Since Anthony's the one who wrote the Rolling Stone review for Standing in the Breach, I'm just going to lightly quote it here and save the rest for our conversation. "You don't know why, but you still try for the world you wish to see," Jackson Browne sings on Standing in the Breach. It's a characteristic sentiment, one that reaches back to the 70s, when Browne distinguished himself as one of America's most visionary and important songwriters. In now classic songs like For Every Man, Before the Deluge, Running on Empty, and The Pretender, Browne took a hard look at why the values of the 60s seemed to die for so many people when the decade passed. Those values, freedom, compassion, generosity, remain vibrantly alive for him. On this superb, inspiring album, he once again stands waiting for every man. The change the world needs now, he sings, is there in everyone. What's most compelling about Browne is that he understands how greed and destruction in the public world devastate our private lives, rendering love both more necessary and harder to sustain. If you know someone who you think might like this show, pass it on and let them know that all the episodes are sitting right there for easy binging. They're all pretty evergreen, so I think people can stumble upon them anytime and fully enjoy them. You can email me at justincox22@gmail.com. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Anthony, and I'll be back in a little bit to introduce Angie.
Oh, how sad they sound, the songs the queen must sing of dying, the prisoner upon her throne, the melancholy sighing.
Anthony, thank you so much for joining this podcast.
It's my pleasure. I'd love to talk about Jackson.
I have really enjoyed the process of reading all the Rolling Stone reviews for these albums over the years.
Oh, yeah.
And I particularly enjoyed this Standing in the Breach review. From what I can tell, it's the first Jackson Browne album you reviewed. How did that come to be, and how do you like that process?
Well, I'd written about Jackson quite a bit, interviewed him many, many times. I think, I was kind of, for years, kind of on the Jackson Browne beat for Rolling Stone. Did long features with him, and also wrote a piece for Men's Journal, which was part of, Jan Wenner owned it along with Rolling Stone. I did a long piece on Jackson for that. And so when this one came up, I just got a phone call asking me if I'd like to write about it. And of course, I was always interested in writing about him because, I think his work is very, very strong. And there's always something to write about. It's not just an album. It's somebody, just having a look at the times and, the state of things and, the state of his own life. And, that was an opportunity that, I was more than happy to take.
The way you describe that is exactly what I've felt in reading these, is that it's not just a review of that piece of music. It's like an assessment of the culture and how that music fits in the culture and how it fits into his career over time. And
Yeah, I mean, I think, Jackson has lived his life on a kind of trajectory. I think all the interests have remained consistent, I mean, there's a kind of certain, a serious kind of literacy to his work. He's, I think, one of the mainstays of what we think of as, the singer-songwriter movement. And, just somebody who has that kind of, degree of personal exploration. But then, of course, around the time of Lives in the Balance, the political interests that, had always been there with him, I think, began to come to the fore. And as time has gone on, I think, he's, intermingled those two things, pretty successfully. And I think that's
Yep.
the case on Standing in the Breach, which is, I think he felt like there was, he traveled a long road by that point. And what you get on this album is, what in kind of literary terms used to be called like an apologia. That doesn't mean like an apology, but more like an explanation of my life. Like, this is what I care about. This is why I care about it. This is what I think about. These are the things that mean something to me.
It's how it's always been, and I know you know it. There can be freedom only when nobody owns it.
The album has a sense of a past, has a sense of having, lived a long life. And
There's a line in your review that I think it kind of puts words to a thought that I've been having, especially in talking about the two records that came out before this and then moving on to this one, which is, you say, the songs on Standing play like conversations between lovers trying to reassure each other of their commitment in a world that devalues the human connection of any kind in favor of profit, which is that it's easy to look at some of those first albums and think like introspective, brilliant, romantic poet type. And then it's easy to like transition over to the like sort of overtly political ones of the 80s and think activist who is fighting the good fight. I'm Alive feels like a revisiting of some of the earlier stuff. And then from Looking East on, and especially on this album, he's kind of doing both. But the way you put that here, the reason that resonates with me is that it's like those two things aren't totally separated. And if you think of them as a conversation between lovers, like the state of the world matters in the state of it has an effect on the state of your heart.
Without a doubt.
And this album does that. And I think you did a good job putting words to that. And
yeah, I think that with Jackson, I mean, I remember the first time I really did a long interview with him was in 1987 for a 20th anniversary issue of Rolling Stone. And the initial idea for the interview was that we were going to talk about art and politics. One of the things that I remember Jackson saying was that, he really liked political songs that were kind of rooted in people's lives, that weren't just, this is what's wrong with this policy, but this is how these kinds of actions and things that are happening in the world affect actual people. And there's, I think some of that is going on here on, Standing in the Breach, the idea of the forces that are at work on us politically and socially affect our emotions and what we feel and what our expectations are. And, it's deep, and I think he handles it pretty well. I mean, it's a tough row to hoe. I mean, it's complicated. And
so let's get into some of the songs, like The Long Way Around, which comes pretty early in the album. Says, I could feel my memory letting go some 2 or 3 disasters ago. It's hard to say which did more ill, Citizens United or the Gulf oil spill. And I'm a long way gone down this road I'm on.
I could feel my memory letting go some 2 or 3 disasters ago. It's hard to say which did more ill, Citizens United or the Gulf oil spill. I'm a long way gone.
So first off, like what you're saying, these things that are happening externally are affecting us internally. Like I could feel my memory letting go some 2 or 3 disasters ago is like
Yes.
the sort of snowballing, piling on of things that can sort of make you disillusioned. And I mean, what's happening? You can just substitute Citizens United and the Gulf oil spill for like global pandemic and civil unrest, racial
Yes.
civil unrest. It's like it can sort of wear you down, and I think that's kind of what you're getting at. Like you're seeing this through the eyes of a human character that's feeling it spiritually and emotionally, but you're talking about what's happening in the world.
I think long way around. I mean, this is a little glib, but certainly when I was thinking about it, it seemed to me like almost an update of Running on Empty. Just that traveling the miles. How far this road I've gone. This kind of idea. There are a lot of references like that on this record.
He's playing a chord progression is definitely nodding to these days, and then references
Yes.
says that in the first line of it.
Yes.
And then, as you say, you can kind of feel the DNA of something like Running on Empty in there too.
I don't know what to say about these days. I'm seeing people changing in the strangest ways.
There's a point on the record, it might be on the title track, where, he just says, look, I realize like these things may never come to pass, like all these things that I want, but I feel like they're in, the possibility to achieve a greater world is in each of us. And again, there's a reference, it seems to me, back there to For Every Man, to that idea, like, we could talk about the big issues all we want, but it's about us individually to make a commitment to try to do something. I think Jackson believes that. I mean, look, I was around Jackson. I remember being with him in L.A. one time. I can't even remember what story we were doing, but in the afternoon, like Jackson was running around, running errands for some particular cause that he was involved in. I mean, running really basic errands, like bringing something from one place to another place, in his car, it's just like, wait here in the car, I'll be out in 10 minutes, that kind of stuff. Like, he wasn't just showing up, to play a song at a benefit. Like, Jackson lives it,
And the world you're waiting for may not come. No, it may not come. But the change the world needs now is there in everyone.
I'm quite sure he's excited about the activism. I think he would feel like, this is something that is long overdue and, so necessary. Listening to this album, which came out, 6 years ago? It's almost sad how relevant it still is. All these things, that piling up of disasters that you alluded to, has only gotten worse. I mean, it's a daily occurrence now.
Yeah.
When on this record, there is a kind of realism. There's a kind of clarity in Jackson's vision about whether or not we're going to get what it is we hope to get. Yeah, man, that question has only gotten more challenging.
This will be the last time that I recite your own words back to you. I promise that. But
that's quite all right.
So at 66, Browne has been an activist long enough to realize that his most firmly held ideals may never achieve fruition. But like John Lennon, he's enough of an artist to understand that imagining that world as it should be is the first step in bringing about that world. Kind of lines up with everything we're talking about right now.
The things I felt like were important when I wrote that review, when I revisited it for our conversation, those things still seem to be the important aspects of, I'm a few years younger than Jackson. I've gone on the ride, man. And it's difficult to kind of, be around at this time and see where all those hopes and dreams have come to, which I think is one of Jackson's, certainly, in the 70s was one of Jackson's great themes. It's like, what happened to all this stuff that we cared about in the 60s? I mean, that was a major, major theme. Like, where did that go? Making an album called The Pretender, like that idea that, started out so young and strong, only to surrender. That's quite an indictment.
Yeah, it is. That song kind of hits you with like these very, very simple daily life details that really can like stop you in your tracks and like assess what you're doing.
Absolutely.
As you said, like he's referencing some frustrations and trouble in the world on this album, and then here we are 6 years later. It's going to be pretty fascinating to see what he has to say about that.
Without a doubt.
To transition to a song like I Could Be Anywhere, he references he's released 2 songs from this new one, and one is very climate focused, and that's not even something we've talked about, but he has a line in I Could Be Anywhere that's, but all the plastic ever made is still here, and no amount of closing our eyes will make it disappear.
They say nothing lasts forever, but all the plastic ever made is still here. No amount of closing our eyes will make it disappear. And the world can't take it very much longer.
Which feels very relevant.
There's one point where it's almost like kind of a sarcasm, that, the idea of inventing something like plastic that just won't go away, that he almost calls it like the pinnacle of human achievement. Jackson inherently, is an optimist, I think. There's that California aspect to him.
So we've spent a good amount of this time talking about that sort of him looking outward at assessing the world around him. But what's interesting about this album is like, it also has, I'd actually say that a lot of his recent albums are intermingling the personal with the sort of societal. He starts it with The Birds of St. Mark's, which is an old song, right? And if I understand correctly, my understanding is that it's about Nico.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. He hasn't specifically said that, and it's unlikely that he would say it, but that's certainly what I thought about.
Yeah.
I wrote a book about Lou Reed a few years ago, and
Nice.
The whole Nico business and Jackson and Nico's first solo record, all of that stuff is, all bound up together. And The Birds of St. Mark's is, a song that he wrote, just before he was about to leave New York and go back to California, which a move that made, I think, consummate sense for him.
To call back all the birds I sent to fly behind her castle walls, and I'm weary of the nights I've seen inside these empty halls.
But his relationship with Nico and, what he picked up being in New York, I think, proved valuable to him.
Yeah.
And this song is an example of it. He talks about, there's the question of the birds of St. Mark's. St. Mark's Place is being referenced there, which was, pretty much the main drag of that era on the Lower East Side, the East Village as it came to be known at that point. And, the birds are, those birds that fly around New York and many other cities. But it's also the birds, the BYRDS. It's a folk rock tune. He talks about Nico's interest in the birds, which certainly I'd never read about anywhere else. But, and he talks about, their sound, that kind of chiming 12-string guitar that Roger McGuinn, whose name was Jim McGuinn back in those days, played. And, that's what he was trying to evoke, that sound. And that folk rock thing, that was crucial for Jackson.
Yeah.
That, in many ways, that's still the kind of bedrock of his sound.
So cool. Like, I'd be curious, like, why that song didn't end up on anything until now. And I think it sort of developed some sort of like prestige and legend about it.
Yeah, a lore. There's certainly a lore grew up about it. But, look, Jackson is nothing if not obsessive, and I think he was writing songs that seemed to me like those early records, which I love, seem so much a product of living a life in California, that I think, a song about Nico and hanging out on St. Mark's Place and, just must have seemed out of step. And then after that, then comes the political stuff and So, by his mid-60s, I think, you can go back and all the reasons that you have for doing this or doing that, they kind of a little bit fade away, because by that point, when you're listening to it, gee, that was a pretty good song, and I'd like to use it. And I think that's the sort of feeling I get for that here. And, when we talk about this album as reflecting a journey traveled, having a song that he wrote 40 years earlier as the first song, I think, sets up that emotional theme very well.
You're kind of in its own way, you're kind of getting it at this perfect time, and it's something familiar. And like the first song on an album, and I firmly believe the first song on a Jackson Browne album a lot of
Yeah.
the time is like a real tone setter.
Yep.
And it puts you in a place, if anything, it could be a little, I could actually say definitively, there are some people who listen to and love Jackson Browne that don't want to hear him say anything political, any of that stuff. That subset definitely exists. And if you get like this first song, Birds of St. Mark's, that you've maybe heard before, and then this song that's kind of nodding to these days a little bit, and next thing you know, you're in something and hearing something you might otherwise avoid. Like there's a little bit of subversion to that I think is cool.
Yeah. I think Jackson gets that. I mean, I don't think it makes him happy to think that there are people who are put off by the political stuff. And, to be fair, look, I remember reading a piece about Don Was, who was talking about a Was Not Was record, that had a kind of social aspect to it. And he was responding to that question and then just said, look, but, it's like, we're not Jackson Browne, like standing up on stage with a pointer, indicating troop movements in Nicaragua. And it pained me to read that, even as it's a good line, it pained me to read it because it indicated a certain kind of stereotypical view of Jackson that I think would have been hurtful for him to see. And, but look, after World in Motion came out, I did a feature in Rolling Stone where I was hanging out with Jackson for a few days in Philadelphia and in New York. And, I wrote the piece. And, Jackson really didn't like it. He called me up. Like, it was early in the morning in New York, so it must have been much earlier in Los Angeles, obviously. And he woke me up. And it was just like, look, and I just saw this story and I want to talk to you about it. Now, there was nothing we could do about that point. It was in the magazine, but
yeah.
I tried to explain to him, he was like, look, this record has all these political ideas on it. And I was like, look, Jackson, we've done that story. I wrote that story a bunch of times. You've talked about it a million times. The politics are in this piece, but I felt it was important for people to, experience this other aspect to you. Jackson's funny and he's, there was a kind of sexiness about him. I remember one time, I brought him up to Rolling Stone. We were, just come by the office and meet me and then we'll go do whatever we need to do. And, man, like every woman who worked in that office was like suddenly, hanging out by the desk or over by the copy machine or just wandering through the corridors because they wanted to see Jackson Browne, and I'd never seen that really before. I mean, Rolling Stone, there were plenty of rock stars who were in and out of that place, but it was a thing when Jackson came, and I wanted to get at some of that. And, I think Jackson felt like that I was, sort of diminishing him a little bit, whereas I sort of felt like I was trying to like present a more three-dimensional view of him rather than the guy with the pointer showing troop movements in Nicaragua,
Well, I don't lead you, I don't feed you no lies. Yeah. And it's not up to me to tell you what you see through your eyes. Yeah.
Fair enough. Like it, that's what was on his mind. And we discussed it. I mean, he was, he was direct, but he was, he wasn't yelling at me. He was Like, look, this is how I see myself. Like, this is, I think he was disappointed, and wanted me to understand that he was disappointed, which, made me feel bad. But I honestly think I was right, and I told him then that I thought I was right. I wouldn't have done it if I didn't think I was right.
The job is to gather information about a person or in their music and be the person to tell the story in a way that's fair and lines up with what you think is accurate. It's not to write the thing that's going to make the person happy.
Well, exactly. And I also felt I was more conscious of this then than I would be now. But, I'd written a lot about Jackson, and I felt like we had covered that. The whole political thing, nobody in their right mind would ever have walked up to me and just said, you don't think Jackson Browne's a serious, social-minded person. I felt that had been fully established, and that what had gotten lost were these other qualities, both in his music and of him as a person. So that's what I was trying to emphasize there, in a three-dimensional way, not to eliminate politics. But, this is a discussion that comes up all the time with Jackson, friends of mine and, people who share his politics even. There's a case to be made that, it kind of cost him in a way.
Yeah. I can't put words in anyone's mouth, but it's like maybe cost him in a way, but based on the music he's continued making, cost him in a way that he seems pretty comfortable and fine with.
Without a question. Oh, yeah, absolutely. No, he, I don't think, ultimately, I think it bothers him a lot more, that story I wrote didn't emphasize politics enough than people saying, oh, gee, he's too involved with politics. I think he can handle that. I think he doesn't like the other thing very much at all.
I'll decide after if I keep this in it, but as part of this, I've joined a couple of Jackson Browne Facebook groups, and I'll just share the episodes as they come out. And it's like, these are people who like Jackson Browne. This is a good place to share them. And one of those groups is pretty explicit about not having discussing politics, which on one hand is funny to me when you think about his career on the whole, but on the other hand, it's very, very understandable because Facebook is a horrible place to talk about politics. So I get it.
Sure.
But I posted the episode that had Lives in the Balance and World in Motion on it. I didn't even say anything political. I just posted those albums, and before anything could happen on it, not only did that get deleted, but I got banned from it from the group.
Oh wow, that's dark.
I was more amused by it than anything.
Yeah, I understand it, but still, that seems extreme.
You wait for the tears to fall, but they won't. You think you should know what to say, but you don't. Here at the break of dawn, the world moving on without her.
Stepping back from all of that, how did, even beyond being a music writer for Rolling Stone and someone who's covered Jackson Browne extensively, how did you come to his music even prior to writing about it, or is that what brought you to his music?
I just heard, as a music fan, I heard Jackson from his first record on.
Can you remember how old you were when that album would have come out?
Let's see, what was it, 1973?
72, I think that one.
1972, so I would have been 21. 20 or 21. And, I really liked it. Look, my background is literature, and so Jackson's use of language and, his writing is still very distinctive. That made a big impression on me. And, there's a kind of beauty to those songs that I find still very attractive, when you get to something like, I point this out all the time to my students, just a line as simple as "In this bed where we both lie, laid for the sky."
Through the whispered promises and the changing light of the bed where we both lie, laid for the sky.
Obviously the metaphor of "laid for the sky," you're going to miss your plane, but also, like you kind of miss that opportunity to take off, to soar, to really get there. And then also in this bed where we both lie, we're laying here, but we're not really being true to each other. We're not even really being true to ourselves. Jackson can get that much done in those few words. So those early records, made a big impression on me.
Yeah, God, that just like talking about those lyrics from Late for the Sky will give you chills. It's just
Completely.
so much there.
Oh, completely.
Across my home has grown the shadow of a cruel and senseless hand. Though in some strong hearts the love and truth remain.
I mean, I could hear the greatest record in the world right now, and I'd be really excited about it, but it's not going to change my life. But hearing a great record when I was 20, that could alter the direction in which I go.
That's actually been a cool recurring thing on this podcast is people who I'm talking to who are talking about the album that meant the most to them. It's like it kind of is like equal parts the album and equal parts the moment. And
well, without a doubt, that's what music does.
Yeah.
There's a kind of innocence on those early records. Jackson was kind of inventing a form, not that, there were other singer-songwriters around, we know that, but, Jackson's point of view, his voice, that kind of almost, kind of hymn-like sense of melody, all of that stuff, I mean, let alone the words, make those songs really distinctive. And there's such a generosity in his vision. I think, a song like For Every Man, make it on your own if you think you can.
Waiting here for every man. Make it on your own, make it if you think you can. If you see somewhere to go, I understand.
As I think everybody knows, that song was meant to be, a response song to Wooden Ships, David Crosby and the Jefferson Airplane wrote that song about, just sailing away and getting away from it all. And Jackson's like, no, man, if it's not for everybody, it's no good, and I think he really believes that, I mean, look, it comes up on this record, as we discussed in the title track, and that's inspiring, and it's inclusive, and it's it's warm and it's human, and man, those qualities endure. When I hear those early songs, even as they're not terribly well recorded, and Jackson will be the first person to say that. He told me one time that was working with John Landau was the first time he really felt he got a decent drum sound on his records. Those early records are not perfect, but sonically. But those songs, they're just lovely.
And there is charm to be found in sonic imperfection too, right?
Yeah, without a doubt.
Like I had this moment today. So as I'm driving around, I'm listening to Standing in the Breach. It runs all the way through. I was streaming it from my phone in my car. And so it ended. The last song ended. I wasn't quite home yet. And so it auto did whatever the algorithm will do to you.
Yeah.
And then it served me up Jamaica Say You Will,
Ooh.
track 1, first album. And I've had the unique experience of like, I'm listening to these things pretty intently each week as I move from album to album. And so I've kind of like time traveled 40 years slowly away from that first song on that first album. And it was kind of cool to like finish the most recent one.
Jamaica was the lovely one, I played her well, as we lay in the tall grass where the shadows fell.
That couldn't have been better.
Yeah, it's just the piano itself, and it is just a really cool, like, God, I kind of want to cycle back right through all this, and the go-round is going to be just me listening to them and not taking any notes.
Yeah, very good.
So you teach literature.
I teach creative writing. And it's the main course I teach is called the Arts and Popular Culture. It's a seminar. It's small. I teach at the University of Pennsylvania. And then I also teach courses that take music as kind of creative spurs, for people to, if they want to write their own songs or to write short stories, to write poems or to or to write criticism for that matter. Not this coming spring, but the spring of whatever 2022, I'm going to be doing a singer-songwriters class, and using Jackson certainly, and everybody else who none of whose names will surprise you, to kind of get them to think about what that kind of writing can be like in other forms.
I am jealous. I would love to be in that class.
Where do you live?
I live on Orcas Island, Washington.
Oh, okay. So you're a way away. All right.
Yes.
I was going to say, now if you live near Philadelphia, you could come and sit in sometime. But,
yeah, that sounds.
That's a long journey.
Everyone I know, everywhere I go, people need some reason to believe. I don't know about anyone but me.
Eventually, I'm from New York originally, and I moved back to New York. And when I came back, about a year after I got back, I got hired at Rolling Stone, and that was really the beginning. I'd done a bunch of stuff before that at smaller places, but when I got to Rolling Stone, it began to make an impact and create opportunities for me, and it was just an incredible thrill. And certainly writing about Jackson and being on, as I put it, the Jackson beat was exciting. It was really, really fun.
Is it right to say, so I think Kit told me this, or I think he alluded to this, but that there was, you'd mentioned earlier that Jackson Browne made the move from New York to California, and that made sense, and it makes total sense to me. I'm originally from California as well, but I feel like he hinted at like some East Coast music writers not necessarily being fans of like what Jackson Browne and the Eagles and the people at the Troubadour and stuff were doing.
Oh, without question. Yeah. Not at Rolling Stone. Because, Rolling Stone was still, I guess there were some people at Rolling Stone who felt that way. Like Chuck Young was certainly part of that cabal. And, the Village Voice was absolutely where, I more associate Kit with writing.
Do you think it's just like an East Coast sensibility type thing, or what?
It was a little bit, punk was on the ascendancy. And so, Jackson got painted with this brush a little bit, but I think it was more about like the Eagles. There's a certain, all of that kind of like California indulgence, I think would rub people who were like living and dying with what the next Ramones record was going to be, it would rub them the wrong way for sure. Because Jackson was more or less David Geffen's first signing. I don't think that's literally true, but he brought David the Eagles, essentially. And of course, the Eagles and David Geffen would have feuds. And, David Geffen gave Jackson his publishing back. When people sign with a label, they make a deal, and, David was his manager. And, Jackson, has all his songs, and has had them for a long time. And he told me one time, that Henley, they were talking about Geffen, and, it's hard for Jackson to be critical of David Geffen, because David was very nice to him. But like, Henley said to him, well, we didn't get a little Christmas present from David Geffen the way you did, this kind of thing. Jackson, in his way, said to me, goes, well, I really feel like David did that because he kind of knew, like, I wasn't, really... that Jackson wasn't a business guy, and it was not necessarily going to be easy for him to like manage his own career. So if he had his own songs and had all that income, obviously, unless he somehow gave that up, it would be hard for him to make too bad of a mistake. And at least that's how Jackson viewed it. Whereas I think Geffen viewed it as like, I sort of think David was in love with Jackson, number one. Number two, I think, I think he felt like, well, he brought me the Eagles, and I'm definitely going to make a fortune off these guys, so he deserves some acknowledgement for that.
His commission.
Yeah, completely. That's a little chip for him.
So like someone like you said, David Geffen, big fan of Jackson Browne, the same was true of Jan Wenner, right?
Oh, yep, absolutely. But that was, that's one of the reasons why Jackson got covered so thoroughly in Rolling Stone. I mean, it was, Jan thought he was important and wanted his stuff out there. And
I'm gonna rid myself a house in the shade of the freeway. Gonna pack my lunch in the morning and go to work each day.
I kind of give myself little breaks from listening to Jackson Browne to make sure it's a thing I love full-heartedly for my whole life. I just always thought of his first 5 albums as being sort of equally scattered through the 70s, but really those first 3 come out in consecutive years. And I just think this is a songwriter I absolutely I look up to more than anybody's. Amazing to me lyrically, melodically, everything. And the idea that those 10 songs on the first album, 10 songs on the second album, and 8 songs on Late for the Sky are 3 years worth of creative output just sort of blew my mind. It's how do you possibly do that?
It was sort of great. So many classic albums that we think about were a half hour long.
It's possible Jackson Browne and listening to that music from my parents has shaped this, but I prefer a 10-song album or 10 songs max. And
sometimes less is more.
I think the point you made earlier about you make these early albums and you're sitting on a song like The Birds of St. Mark's, but make the choice to not include it on that finite collection of songs because the collection says something and that song would say something different that would take you out of the larger whole. That's kind of you're curating those songs because they stack next to each other tastefully.
And and Jackson's a little bit that way anyway. I mean, he seems to have this kind of hey, he's free and easy. He's Jackson Browne, he's brushing the hair out of his eyes every 20 seconds. But Jackson is an obsessive guy, and I'm sure if he, found a reason about a word and a line in a song, that was that. That wasn't going to make it on. It could be the best song that was ever written. And, he didn't get it the way he wanted it. That was that.
Fast Times at Ridgemont High and can really bounce to Somebody's Baby. And it was funny to have the conversation about Somebody's Baby was recorded around the same sessions of that album. And Jackson Browne essentially makes that same choice to no, I'm not putting this on the album. And
yes. I mean, his record company must have wanted to fucking shoot themselves. He has this big hit, and but it didn't suit Lawyers in Love. I mean, Lawyers in Love is a really interesting record, and Somebody's Baby is a great song. It's a great radio song, and I love it every time I hear it. But it's not that, it's not. I mean, even an image like Lawyers in Love was so perfect, very perfect for that time. It was that and The Pretender are very early indictments of yuppie culture. Everybody's negotiating, everybody's out for theirs. Even in love.
Yeah.
I remember talking to Jackson one time about the song Lawyers in Love, and there's a W.H. Auden poem which I will attempt to recite this verse if I can remember it. Like love, we don't know where or why. Like love, we can't compel or fly. Like love, we often weep. Like love, we seldom keep. And I remember reciting those lines for Jackson, and I don't know what he sort of I thought it was something that would really kind of intrigue him, but it didn't. But I don't know if he thought I was suggesting he'd stolen the idea or something, which I of course wasn't. That happens all the time, by the way. If you ever say to an artist this reminds me of that, they never like it.
They receive it purely as what, you stole this.
Yeah, I mean, at worst as a potential lawsuit, or at best it's derivative. Whereas what I was saying was look, that's a really great image that one of the 20th century's great poets also used.
I kind of admire that he'll let you know he doesn't like it.
Yeah. Well, he didn't let me. He just didn't respond. But he was like, "Oh yeah, that's interesting," whatever. Like, but the other song on the album, was like that.
Right. Well, this was really awesome to talk to you.
Yeah, this was fun, man.
I really appreciate having you around to talk about it.
Super, man. It was a really fun conversation.
There's a train every day, leaving either way. There's the world, you got a ways to go.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. We are going to wind this thing down by talking to Rolling Stone writer Angie Martoccio. I got some emails and comments early on in this series from people who were kind of initially skeptical about a Jackson Browne podcast coming from a millennial. Well, Angie is almost 10 years younger than I am, and she has the same depth of love for his music. She also has a firm grip on new music, and so we're going to introduce you to some artists in Jackson Browne's orbit like Phoebe Bridgers, Dawes, Tal Wilkenfeld, and Blake Mills. These are all really good songwriters. And in addition to that, we're just going to talk about Jackson himself and what his music has meant to us. You can find Angie on Twitter at Angie Martoccio, AngieMartoccio. How long have you been at Rolling Stone?
I was an intern in 2014, which honestly feels like forever ago now. And after that, I left and continued to freelance here and there. And then I officially came on staff in 2018.
Well,
so I was, I was going to say I was Jan Wenner's assistant, actually. That's like my first level there at the job.
Incredible. That's super cool.
Yeah.
Well, awesome. So then let me see how to characterize this. Like one of the launching points for this podcast was I don't tend to run into people and I don't tend to have a bunch of friends who all like love Jackson Browne or even like or know Jackson Browne. That being said, I know that he's a big artist and he's a respected artist, but the way it's come up multiple times in the podcast, especially at the beginning in the early albums, he's not typically like mentioned when you talk about like Neil Young and Bob Dylan and Joni Mitchell on this sort of songwriter side of things. And then when you talk about like these sort of mega hit 70s pop bands like the Eagles and Fleetwood Mac, he's kind of like on the fringes of both of them, maybe somewhere in the middle of them. How did you come to find Jackson Browne, and have you had any kind of similar experience? Is he?
I mean, first off, like I came to him as many people do through my parents, where my mom graduated high school in 1973 in Miami in this very suburban area. And like Late for the Sky came out and that was like her album of the year. And so I grew up like just knowing those songs, and like obviously beyond like Doctor My Eyes, this was something that I really strongly like related to. And I remember being a child, and of course like a lot of parents of that generation, my mom would play like Bob Dylan and Neil Young, and Joni Mitchell was always around. But I always loved hearing Jackson the most just because of his songwriting. And I really related to it even as like a preteen, because, his songs are so bummed out sometimes, and they're so relatable when you're at that age of adolescence. And that was really it. Like my mom to this day, like when I hear a lot of his albums as I'm living far away in New York now, it's a very emotional reaction that I have where I miss her when I hear it automatically.
Nice.
And now on my own, like as a journalist, like obviously my peers in the office are very aware of him, and especially through our magazine, he's been covered throughout the decades. He's very close with Jan Wenner, our founder. And beyond that, I mean, I have a lot of friends in Brooklyn. It's, of course, like I worked for years in a coffee shop. Like I spent like 10 years working in coffee, and a lot of them, I had a lot of baristas who would play Doctor My Eyes all the time in the cafe, but it was never beyond that. And that kind of drove me crazy sometimes. So I'd be like, there's so much more than this. Of course, it's an amazing song, but as you know, as many Jackson fans know, like that's just like the beginning, like starting point for what he's capable of.
Yeah, and what's kind of cool about Doctor in My Eyes is like not only is there more than Doctor in My Eyes, there's kind of more to Doctor in My Eyes than you're probably hearing in the background of the coffee shop.
It's a really sad song. Yeah, totally.
Doctor, my eyes have seen the years and the slow parade of fears without crying. Now I want to understand.
But that said, if you took it and were like, here, listen to this, and put on Late for the Sky in that place, it might, it's going to do a different thing to the vibe in that room, I'm sure.
Totally. And I have colleagues who are, I mean, I'm 28 years old, and a lot of my colleagues who are younger staffers, they kind of make fun of me that like my Harry Styles is Jackson Browne. Like that's what they equate it to, because that's how excited I get whenever he's brought up, or whenever I do get to interview him. Like I love it so much because he's just incredible.
Yeah, it's funny. I was on a call with a bunch of coworkers recently, and someone said something really specific that they were doing, and I said like, oh, I wish I loved anything as much as you like that. I don't remember what it was, and then one of my colleagues said like, yo man, you're making like a 14 episode Jackson Browne podcast. I think you do. Like, oh,
yeah,
that's a good point. I think you're
definitely
right. And so so you're 28 years old. I see you write about more than just like 70 singer-songwriters and classic rock and like deep dives into like the Neil Young discography and stuff. But do you have like a beat there? Do you tend to follow that stuff, or how do you determine what you're writing about?
It depends. I mean, that usually is my beat, where it kind of rotates around anniversaries of albums or specific moments in classic rock history. I really go for that kind of thing. And it also is just about like what I want to pitch. I kind of have this dual focus of older singer-songwriters and then like newer indie rock artists. So I love to like sit down with like, you know, a 21-year-old artist as like, we have that franchise called Artists You Need to Know.
Yeah.
And I do tend to write about that if there's a new album coming out or I'm approached with that. But I also kind of like to have a mixture of that, where like my, you know, deep dive into Neil Young's catalog was really just me being like, hey, I'd love to write this. It's time that we do one of these on him. And my editor was like, yeah, no problem. Let's do it. So I kind of like to keep both of those in balance as I work.
Nice.
So.
Well, that's a pretty great transition to one thing you and I talked about before this conversation was looking at, I don't know, the current generation and how Jackson Browne might influence them. And I think some good examples are like, you actually connected me with Jonathan Bernstein, who I interviewed for the previous episode, and he just reviewed the Phoebe Bridgers album and wrote an article about Blake Mills. And you and I have talked about that a little bit. And Phoebe Bridgers had an album come out recently. These are people that are outwardly vocal about Jackson Browne as an influence. Yeah.
Oh, totally. And of course, like as with what I just said, where I love this whole like era of the 70s and like anyone who came from that. And I try to really keep my cool when I have like a really young artist being like, oh, I love Jackson Browne. And like my eyes kind of widen and I'm like, oh, really? That's cool. Tell me about that. But really, I'm just like bursting with emotion because it's so exciting that he's really caused this. There's so many of them who are so influenced by that. And I don't even bring them up. They just tell me. So it's pretty amazing.
I think something that Jackson Browne does is, I know I hear it in Phoebe Bridgers for sure, is like, yeah, these are catchy, kind of accessible songs, but kind of like what we just talked about with Doctor My Eyes. There's beyond like Somebody's Baby. They're not just those pop songs. Like there is a thing happening beneath it. Similar, and like on the new Phoebe Bridgers album, the song Kyoto, like you can bump and bounce to that, but there's another thing happening there. And I think Jackson Browne does that really well. And so do some of these specific artists we're talking about.
Day off in Kyoto, got bored at the temple, looked around at the 7-Eleven. The band took the speed train, went to the arcade. I wanted to go, but I didn't. You called me from a payphone, they still got payphones. It cost $1 a minute to tell me you're getting sober. And you wrote me a letter, but I don't have to read it.
Yeah, I mean, with Phoebe, it's very evident in how introspective her song lyrics are and how deep she likes to go. And she can still kind of elevate that with like a great melody and make it kind of lighter. very similar to like I See You on that the Punisher album and things like that. And she opened up by talking about Jackson through her brother who was named after him,
Oh, wow.
and started to tell me, yeah, her brother is literally named Jackson. and um and just because her mom was a super fan, and her way of saying, like, before we even talked about his influence, she was like trying to tell me how kind he was to her because they met. And the way she put it was like, I still actually wrote this down for my transcript, which is just that she said, he remembers my fucking mom's name. And that was her way of like stressing just how generous he is to younger songwriters. And I really thought that was cool, where he's so personable. And all of them have told me this, from Phoebe to even Tal Wilkenfeld, this bass virtuoso.
Nice.
Yeah.
I walk the same road to work each Monday. Every step tears at my heel.
One of the obvious ones is Dawes, who a couple of their band members have played on some of his albums. It's another band that you could hear. You just hear the influence. It's just there.
And now the only piece of advice that continues to help is anyone that's making anything new only breaks something else. When my time comes.
I remember like you talking about like you having some of these interviews and Jackson Browne coming up in them. I remember like kind of like peak Arcade Fire, like maybe, I don't know if that's like 10 years ago or so, like grabbing a magazine in a friend's house. I don't even remember what magazine it was. And then just kind of thumbing through it and kind of being not even far into the article. I should look for the article, but just like 4 or 5 mentions of Jackson Browne. Like I remember the feeling being, I'm not even like a gigantic Arcade Fire fan, but now I want to do all the work I can do to try to become one because
Exactly, totally.
yeah.
Yeah, that's how I felt about Dawes. I mean, I saw that in 2011, there were videos of Jackson and Taylor Goldsmith performing together at Occupy Wall Street. And I didn't really know who Dawes was at the time. And I was like, all right, well, I don't know this band very well, but if they're, playing with Jackson, like I'd love to get to know them more.
Yeah. Jonathan was talking about like he's so a lot of these artists that we're talking about are Southern California people, right? That and that there's a little bit of like a personable influence, like not maybe super loud and vocal about it, but just he seems responsive to being an influence. I mean, he sang on a Phoebe Bridgers song, and it's just kind of a cool colliding of worlds for me, and it sounds like for you too.
Yeah, and it's also how he treats them, I think, is something to really like discuss, where it's that he has stressed to a lot of them, like he does not like being called a mentor because he wants to be treated as an equal. So I had Tal Wilkenfeld tell me that, where she's like, yeah, he doesn't like me calling him that, even though he's my teacher. And his response is, well, you teach me too. And it is because not only is he like generous to them, but he teaches them, he sits down with them, he gives guitars to a lot of younger musicians, he introduces them to others. I remember he introduced Tal Wilkenfeld to Ben Montent, who ended up playing on her record. So it's that he kind of becomes this like great, not only mentor, but just like he connects them with others in the music world, and he really wants to help out, which I think is really important.
Very cool. And as you say that, like, it's easy to see that in terms of being a mentor because he's older and been around. But if you kind of think of how he fit into that like troubadour Laurel Canyon scene, like when he's in the 70s, he's kind of existing in that same way, right? He's kind of floating around among all these people and all these things that are happening there.
Oh, yeah. And then in preparation for this interview, I came across a video I hadn't seen in a very long time. I think it was like 2013. And it was Blake Mills and Fiona Apple and Jackson singing inside this like California cozy, I think it's like a coffee shop. Like you would honestly think it's from a long time ago, just because it really echoes the entire vibe of the early 70s in California.
Awesome. So did you, here's a question I'll have that I asked this question because I've spent 3 months zipping through week by week every single album. And honestly, like I've been forthright about the fact that like this is the closest I've ever listened to Lawyers in Love and Lives in the Balance and World in Motion. Like I I was aware of what they sounded like. I was aware of what they said. I was aware of like how they were received and everything. But it was really cool, like kind of diving into those. Have you listened through everything? How do you feel about it as like Jackson Browne's full discography is?
It's a hard question, right? Because like even Lawyers in Love, if you spend time in record stores as I do, I've come across that record. And I don't think I know of another album cover that's made me as happy as Lawyers in Love just to look at.
Nice.
It's almost like he's trying to navigate through the 80s with this paddle in water on top of a car. So I can definitely see why it's a little off-putting even now to listen to. It's harder music. He was trying to figure out, how am I supposed to go through the MTV era? And I think looking back now, I do enjoy the music, obviously. I don't turn to it as quickly as I do throughout the 70s work. Or even for that matter, like the early aughts. Like I do think Standing in the Breach is great. And the new album that's coming out in the fall is fantastic. But it really depends on like how emotionally tied to those records I do feel. And that isn't really the 80s for me.
Yeah, I think there is a context when I will put those albums on now. And I don't think I knew what that context was in the past. Again, none of that's going to supplant Late for the Sky or For Every Man or Running on Empty for me, but it kind of like the story the piece you did with Neil Young, right? Neil Young's the most exaggerated version of this of like almost any artist you can think of, but I know that a podcast like this would be really boring if it just was singer-songwriter songs for 4 decades.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, Neil's 80s are also like, and you could do an entire podcast on just those 80s records alone. There's so much to say for how bizarre some of the songs are, but how they've also really, I don't know. I think maybe it's because I'm a super fan and I'm obviously biased, but I love records like Landing on Water. I think it's fantastic. So it really depends on either like your perspective on it now, how you felt about it then. And I really do think it's been so many years since that it's a great time, like you're doing with this podcast, to look at it through this lens of like, let's focus on someone's discography and spend time with these albums that were panned.
Yeah. If even I, a person doing this podcast, wasn't inclined to like sink fully into those albums in the 80s, like a lot of people who drop off from something like that won't also even hear the ones in the 90s or the 2000s. But if you're going if you click subscribe on a podcast feed and you go one at a time, it can kind of like carry you through without committing to listening to them and getting some context going into them. And it's like especially cool that it's going to lead up to him putting out a new album, like you just said. Like,
yeah, and I'm sure, knowing Jackson, that he definitely probably heard about this podcast and was really thrilled and honored, because it's, something that you don't see every day.
Well, Angie, thank you so much. It's cool to talk to you about this. As you can probably tell, that interview cut off in the final seconds, so you don't hear Angie saying goodbye, but I want to thank her so much for joining me, and thanks to Anthony DeCurtis and to everybody who came on this show. I had a lot of fun doing it, and it was really just gratifying and just really cool to kind of sink into these songs in ways that I never had before. And I also want to thank my family, my wife Bianca, and my kids Noah and Milo, who are 7 and 4. Whether you know it or not, you've heard them in the background of these episodes more often than not. And my cat, who hangs out in the room with me while I do it. Take a moment to rate and review if you have not. That's another way for people to organically discover the show. Thanks again, everyone, for listening to it. Please do pass it along, and keep an eye out for another episode in the months ahead. I am going to play you out with a little bit of one of his new songs called Downhill from Everywhere, which will appear on that forthcoming album.
Downhill from here, down